We'll get to that in a minute. But growing up in Colorado, my mom and I had a long-standing date every morning. 30 minutes drive is what we had every morning. It was a drive from one side of Colorado Springs, Colorado, to another side. We lived south and we had to go north, and it was always cold. That's one thing that I remember. I always wore a big coat. I always got a donut, and I always sat there and just shivered. But it was cold and dark, and there was only one other thing that I remember fondly, is that I always waited to listen to the radio. And I would always, it just happened that that time of the day, it was always the same broadcaster. This broadcaster was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma on September 4th, 1918. The newscaster was the son of a police officer and a Danish immigrant. He dropped his surname when he began his radio career at KVOO in Tulsa. The broadcaster met his wife, Lynn Angel Cooper, at KXOK AM when he was in St. Louis, where they were both newscasters. He proposed on the first date, and she didn't accept until a year later. And the couple married in 1940. He and Angel were members of the Humane Society from the group's founding in 1954. Later, his son became involved as well. The broadcaster discussed issues of animal cruelty in his broadcasts and publicly endorsed animal protection initiatives in Arizona and in California. In 1979, People magazine reported that he made about $2 million a year. That was as much as Barbara Walters, Walter Cronkite, and Mike Wallace combined. In the year 2000, ABC extended his contract by 10 years and $100 million. In 2005, Forbes reported that a $30 million income came in for that broadcaster. And in 2006, he reportedly accounted for 10% of ABC's $300 million a year in advertising earnings. He was a coiner of words. He was nearly charged with espionage, and he was well connected, to say the least. Following his brush with the law, his friendship with President Hoover provided rather beneficial to his show. In 2010, his FBI file was released under the Freedom of Information Act. The 1,400 pages of information indicated that officials in the Bureau were happy to add meat to the bones of his stories, which he frequently sent them in advance. Agents routinely fact-checked and added material to his pieces from the mid-50s until his death. He was named American of the Year, Father of the Year, Salesman of the Year, Commentator of the Year, Person of the Year, elected to the Radio Hall of Fame, Demoli Hall of Fame of Oklahoma Hall of Fame, listed in a Gallup poll of Americans' most admired men, and received 11 Freedom Foundation awards, the Horatio Alger Award, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and an honorary degree from Washington University in St. Louis. And just as we would pull into the parking lot of work for her and school for me, we would hear the moment we were all waiting for, at least me and my mom, and probably a lot of people listening, for the name of the person or the thing that the story was about. Paul Harvey always had a way with words, and he kept me listening each morning and full of random tidbits of knowledge. And now, you know the rest of the story. If you still don't know who Paul Harvey is, talk to somebody who's older than me, and they will let you know who he is. It was really cool to hear his voice, and he had some amazing catchphrases. It was awesome. Now, can we take a minute? We need to take this moment in. Cleopas and probably his wife were there with the 11. for what was going on at the time. They were there at the cross, and they were there when the women came back from the tomb. They were getting ready to disperse, probably back to their home. It was even the same day that the women came back from the tomb. They knew all that had happened and heard the story from the women. But it seemed like they didn't give credit to the first ones who Christ appeared to. Instead, it seemed as they were surprised and taken back by the words. I think that probably would have been my reaction. What? Wait, that's weird. It would have been that kind of confusion. Cleopas and his wife heard the news, but seems to be more focused on getting home because their whole concept and thinking was focused the wrong way. There were disciples that heard the women and went out quickly, but these two were determined to hold on to their mindset, and they left. It could not have been too far down the road that this story starts. This couple still sitting there in their dismay as they walked, talking back and forth. And they probably even talked about the things that happened that day. Probably the day that he died. And even about in between. As they were still perplexed, Jesus came upon them and started walking with them. And in verse 16, of course, we see, but they were kept from recognizing him. This seems to be a standing point for the first couple of sightings that we see Jesus, or that Jesus shows himself. Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20, verse 14 says, at this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize who he was. She asked the stranger, please, I just want the body so that I can take care of it. And then Christ reveals himself to her. He even calls her by name, saying, Mary. And it comes to her. Cleopas and his wife lack the recognition of Jesus. It doesn't seem like it's something that is God-driven in a sense, but more from a spiritual concealment that is coming from the human side of the equation. Even though it might be a spiritual issue, the purpose of the lack of seeing Christ for who he truly was gives a fresh understanding later of the revelation of the risen Christ. When Jesus asks Cleopas, what are they talking about on the road to Emmaus? It seems that they were very down, very in disbelief. They just could not grasp this concept. And Cleopas's response to Jesus was, are you joking me? Are you kidding? Were you not the only person that wasn't in Jerusalem when this all happened? It's almost like he's saying, are you crazy? Are you clueless to what just happened? Jesus answered, what things? I don't think Jesus was being naive, but maybe trying to lead to see truly what Cleopas was talking about. We see Cleopas trying his hardest to inform Jesus of all that had happened in the context of how he, Cleopas, understood things. In verse 21, we see Cleopas saying, we had hoped that Christ would redeem Israel. His understanding here was more of a political sense than it was a spiritual sense. Remember, of course, Cleopas and his wife's eyes were still hidden. And these words that he spoke give us the understanding of this misconception. He even spoke of the third day that Jesus told him that he would rebuild this temple. But he was thinking with probably a political coup concepts and not understanding Christ's true kingdom and how it would come about. What comes to mind for me is the fact that Cleopas first wondered how Jesus could not have known all of these things. And the cool thing is that Jesus flips the story. And he says to him, "How foolish are you, and how slow to heart for you to believe?" What I do love about this story again is that Jesus it points it out that he's slow to heart, but he walks with him, and he walks with Cleopas and his wife, and he walks them through scriptures. He walks them from Moses and on and further, all until the understanding that they could see about what this truly was meaning. I think we now get to the heart of this text. This is the point in which we see Jesus and the two coming close to the end of their journey. In all the time I have spent working through this passage, it brings me to this critical moment when Jesus is deciding to go on ahead as he is going further. This time, we see the two offer. And I think it's Jesus trying to say, I need to find out truly what these people are, who they are to the core. They, Cleopas and his wife, urging him to stay, at least to have a meal with them, if not stay for longer. Jesus accepted this invitation. They gathered around the table to eat, and the text says that he took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Being part of these disciples and the crew that was around Jesus, this seemed to have become something that was familiar to them. Do you have something like that in your life? In my life, my children and my wife, we sit around every evening right before our kids go to bed. And if you were to take out the voice of my kids and just show me the text of what was said, I could tell you which child prayed that prayer that evening. Coming down from just exactly, sometimes it's a run-on sentence that's really long. That's probably Camden, okay? There's one that is heartfelt, usually, that talks about school and something good that happened to him and for his family. And of course, every one of them talk about their puppies. And that one's probably Grayson. But the thing is, it's so apparent because you can tell when your kids are praying, even if it was just written down. And the cool thing is sometimes I would probably get confused because I see a passionate prayer that comes that would confuse me with Grayson's prayer, with Peyton's prayer, because he gets passionate sometimes when he prays. And he's very loving and caring, and he usually does a really great job. Braden, he is just direct and to the point. He knows what he's going to say. But we know, right? It's familiar. We have things like that in our life that you would say, oh yeah, I know who that is, even by a phone call, how somebody answers the phone. I bet you if you called the church, you would hear 2 different messages and you could probably tell who's answering the phone in the office, right? There's a certain way that I can answer the phone, right? Say, it's a great day at the Moscow Church of the Nazarene. This is Pastor Kyle. How can I help you? You could probably tell by the time I say, it's a great day, you know it's me, right? Pastor Valerie says it a different way, but we also know who it is when she says it, and she hasn't even said her name at the beginning of it. When the familiar words are heard, we see 3 things that happen to these two. The first one is that their eyes were open. Their true hearts are shown, and their downcast demeanor is lifted. What an amazing moment that would be. This is a true case of not letting your hearts be so troubled by what you think is going on and staying with the passion and belief that you know true in your heart. As we see and hear, as soon as that hits, their hearts were burning, right? I think their hearts were probably starting to tingle when they hit that text, when Christ was telling them about Moses and all of the things that showed who Christ was. The second one is Christ disappears from their sight. We might think that this could be disappointing in the light of that they did not truly get to see him until their eyes were opened. But we see how Cleopas and his wife questions were not where Christ went, but why their hearts didn't burn within them harder or hotter, especially when he quoted Scripture. For me, it's a cool thing to see here that they didn't say, "Oh man, where'd it go?" They were not worried about that. They were worried about their own hearts, their own passion, what was inside of them, and how they could have been and maybe seen in a different light. The third thing is this. It's a movement to action. Remember, it was late in the day. They had just traveled about 7 miles, and this was one of those moments that moves you to action. 8 years ago on Wednesday, I personally had one of those moments of a movement to action. I was in Nampa, Idaho. My wife was in Lebanon, Oregon. She was about 9.5, maybe even 10 months pregnant at the time. Her due date wasn't for 3 or 4 weeks. And so my wife lovingly said, go to Nampa, it's okay. Peyton and Grayson were both late when they came, so, it's going to be just fine. Sure. As I was there with teenagers at our regional event at Northwest Nazarene University, I get this phone call from my wife. And she says, "You know what? I think my water broke, but I don't know. I think I'm just going to take a nap, and maybe it'll just kind of go away." Right. So she talked to me, and I said, "Do I need to be worried about this? Do I need to come home? Do I need to be moving to action?" "No, I think it'll go away. He's not due for another 3 weeks. So I think I'm just going to rest, and if I need anything, I'll just call Vicky." She was our church secretary at the time. And I said, "Okay, you go rest." I promptly went to one of the college kids who was attending Northwest Nazarene at the time, and I said, "We need to check on flights." And I said, "We also need to figure out a plan on how to get me to said flight." So we found out that there was a flight that was, leaving about 6:30 in the evening. And of course, you need about an hour and a half to get through whatever with silly airports. So about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock rolls around, and I start talking to this student, and I said, "You know what? Maybe we should drive from Nampa to Boise. Maybe we just take a ride. And you know what? If she calls me back, then we just took a ride to Boise, and we just come on back." He said, "You know what? I think that's a good idea." So we got in the car, we left, we were driving towards the airport, and as I was getting off on the exit for the airport, our friend Vicky calls and says, "Well, your wife thinks that you probably should be on that flight." I said, "I figured." So I got to the airport, and it was one of those amazingly awesome things that I've always dreamed of doing in my life. And that was, I walked up to the counter and I said, "I need your next flight to Portland, Oregon." "Okay." You've seen it in the movies all the time, right? I got to do it. It was cool. It took me from about 6:30 until I think I got in about midnight, because I had to go from Boise to Seattle to Portland, and then it was an hour and a half drive to home. Now, during all that time, layover in Seattle, I think I got a massage. It was awesome because I knew it was going to be a long night. So she wasn't mad at me because I didn't tell her until after it was all over. So, but it was one of those moments. I got in at midnight and, everything was good. When I got there, she said, I think she got an epidural. So she was at the point of saying, well, the nurses were saying, she's going to rest. Why did you just sleep? Both of you. I rushed here for all of this, and you're telling me to go to sleep. Okay. Woke up 8 o'clock. Well, probably about 7:30. And the doctors came in and said, it's time to have a baby. And sure enough, 8:05 a.m. on April 26th, Braden came into this world. And it was a wonderful story of a call to action that I had to have, that I had to go with. It was amazing. What an amazing feeling when it is in your heart, when God speaks to you or pushes you to action. So, where are we today? Sometimes we let our disappointment with how things should go push us into being downcast, or just down for that matter. We struggle with all that is going on, leading us to be hindered to see or recognize what Christ can do or what he will do. Listen to the words from 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 to chapter 2, verses 2. It says this, since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart. For you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable through the living and enduring word of God. For all men, like grass, and all of their glory is like flowers of the field. The grass withers, and the flowers fall. But the word of the Lord stands forever. And this is the word that was preached to you. Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation. And as we worship together again, listen to these words from this great song. The words that hit home for me were this: I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thee true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Now listen and see with your own eyes the rest of the story.